We have a fire going. We have a golf course in the background, and there's no golfers tonight. I don't know what's going on there. That's kind of odd. It's snowing again, and I'm just not going to shovel. I'm over that whole shoveling thing. Like, I don't know, whatever. It can build up, and it's going to melt in July probably. So I'm just going to live through that. We have our friend Tress with us from White Rose tonight. He was out here do you guys mind if I go inside? It's kind of cold, right? I can do that. He was out here in, was it September, I think, Tress? Is that right?
It was right before harvest, just about 2 weeks before we harvested our first fruit this past harvest.
Right. All right. Yeah, it's way nicer in here. I think I'm just going to do that. I mean, a beautiful Montana evening, but I think it's enough of that. So we have a few housekeeping things like always. There's the cows again. All right, yeah, there we go. Last night, our winemaker had a technical difficulty and didn't show up. So Tress, we're really happy that you're here tonight.
I'm glad I'm here. I'm having a technical difficulty in trying to get you a PowerPoint to show you photos. So I might have to just talk a picture here.
I'll bet you can do that.
Tress, I have to make you a co-host. I'll do that right now.
Okay.
Well, welcome everybody. We have another Saturday night, all social distancing and doing the proper thing. And you guys have had so much fun. I've heard from so many people that they love this, what's going on in our social distancing world, and we can't wait to get back together without the distancing part, right? So, but we've learned a lot and we've had fun, and so today we had the busiest day we've ever had at Fifth and Line for meals to go. Literally, I went through, I don't know, like 830 to go containers approximately, something like that.
Oh.
Well, but maybe 83 or maybe 8.3, I don't know, but some number like that. I was back cooking, and my old accountant Troy Lindquist came in, and he's like, "You're actually working, Mark?" I'm like, "Yeah, I know. This whole coronavirus thing is just horrible. I'm back to working. We have one employee left. Like, we need to figure this out or sell it or something." My friend Jeff Milholland invested in our company. He bought 50% for $1 a couple of days ago. That was about what it's worth at this point. Anyway, so we had a great day. We had fun. We sold a ton of, it's just odd when you're in the restaurant business, what you sell. Like, we didn't sell a steak and egg for like 3 weeks, and we had like 8 today. And then, you know, Tara actually put the burrito out on Facebook, and we sold 2 burritos out of the 830 orders we had. So you never know. I'm like, I guess it's probably like the wine business, I guess, right? So we sold a bunch of the tastings for next week already, and we hope you guys all join in with us again next week. I know you saw the governor's directive to drink every night, and it's fine. And I don't know if he's right or wrong, but you know, whatever. If he directs it, let's just do it. Let's have wine every night until this thing is behind us, and we'll have fun with it. And then last night was pretty interesting. So Tress, what happened was, I actually sent the video out of the Chicago. You remember the movie Chicago? Where,
oh yeah.
Where Richard Gere and was it Renee Zellweger were doing the song and dance show with all the puppeteers, and I sent that out last night. I'm like, that's what I feel like we did tonight. Like, just like, so he didn't show up because he had technical difficulties. And all of a sudden, like, yeah, what am I going to do? And so Kathy said, well, just talk about you. And I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty good at that. So I did that. And
I hope it went well.
We did. I mean, for me, I told Tara I laughed at myself, and she's like, well, of course you would. So anyway, so I think that's about it, right? Tara, anything else you want to talk about on the Fifth and Line side before we get started with Tress? Tara, I'm talking to you now.
Oh, sorry. We're talking about the Easter Bunny over here. No. What?
Anything else you want to talk about as far as Fifth and Line before Tress gets involved here?
No, we're sorry. I just got distracted for a minute. No, we're good. I hope more people sign up for our wine tasting next week, and you can do that over the weekend and pick it up on Tuesday.
Nice.
That's all I got.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think we're done too. So I want to talk a little bit about Tress, what happened last year when we already talked about the fifth in line farm to table. We used to do table to farm, which is pretty fun, where Tara lined up with Farmer Bob and we hauled everything out to his damn farm, and it was nothing but work and everything was horrible in my opinion. She loved it, and we charged not enough money, and we actually lost money on it. And so then this year we did a farm to table, which it makes more sense. I mean, we have a table right there, and the farm can come to us and then they can do all the work. And so Tress was our resident wine maker, and he did a great job. And we cooked outside at the end of our building. Tara put up a beautiful tent, and whatever. Wow. Always does a great. Nicole did an awesome job, kind of setting the whole thing up. And so we've been talking about that quite a bit, I know, with everybody. But in October we're going to have another one, or September, or whenever. I just want to do it either before harvest or after harvest, and have another great winemaker. Chess, you're welcome to come back. We can do more than one.
I would love to. There was something special about actually being able to have a dinner with other people and socialize and drink wonderful wine and eat incredible food. That seems like some sort of distant dream.
Right. What are you talking about? Right. Anyway, it's nice to get together tonight with Tress again. I've written scripts for the whole thing, and I have nothing tonight. So Tress, we're just gonna wing it.
Let's do it.
I'm kind of tired. Tress and I talked earlier today. I'm like, we have to talk about something different than oak programs and whatever. Like let's talk about stuff that's different than what we've been doing. So Tress, I think the one thing I want to do is tell them about your history and what's going on in the history of you, and then the history of your joining White Rose and what's going on in that whole.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the sort of quick version for me is that I grew up in Oregon. I'm an Oregon native, and I grew up in a tiny little town on the Oregon coast in the middle of nowhere. It's a little town called Gold Beach, which is about 6 hours from anything. And so, I looking back now, I really appreciate how special growing up in Oregon was. But by the time that I finished high school, I was sort of ready to see the world a little bit. So I left Oregon for a long time. I went to college in Virginia, and then eventually moved into the tech industry and spent about 11 years between New York and San Francisco. And it wasn't until sort of, good chunk into that career where I thought it was kind of time to try something different. And I had the opportunity to come back to Oregon to take care of my parents, and was sort of getting interested in the wine thing when I was in California. Started taking classes at Oregon State, and eventually sort of jumped in whole hog and did research on Pinot Noir. So my research was exclusively focused on Pinot Noir and malolactic fermentation, actually. And eventually got my master's degree in enology from Oregon State. And so started a second career in winemaking. It's kind of funny because I think it's sort of a well-trod path, technology to wine, but there's a lot of sort of parallels that exist there. I think I did project management in tech, and that I look at every bottle of wine as basically a 2-year project. And so that project management side sort of comes in handy when it comes to making wine, because it's a long development cycle. Every bottle, it's about 2 years of work that we put into. So it sort of worked out pretty well that way. After I did my studies at Oregon State, I worked at a winery called Lemelson Vineyards in Carlton. Spent 4 years there. Beautiful, beautiful gravity flow facility focused on inoculated.
All right, yes. We have so many follow-up questions already. You have to remember this: malolactic fermentation, gravity. All right,
beautiful.
So keep going, but remember those two.
All right. So yeah, we'll definitely geek out on that stuff. And I spent 4 years learning under a gentleman named Anthony King, who had come up through UC Davis, made wine at Acacia and Carneros for a number of years. Mark and I were talking earlier, there's a lot of northern migration, let's say, from California to Oregon. So even going back, some of you guys probably were in the Irie tasting earlier this week. David Light came up from California. He brought a lot of California clones. That worked for Pinot, didn't quite work for Chardonnay. So we had to we misfired on Chardonnay, and then we're about 20 years behind on Chardonnay in Oregon, although we've figured out the right clones. But there's a reason that I think a lot of Californians were attracted, or people from California were attracted to here, is that there's something very special about Oregon wine. It's a very very beautiful place for wine. So there's something about the terroir of this place that is more reminiscent of France and Burgundy specifically than a lot of parts of California. So that drew a lot of people here. What's that?
You and I talked about earlier, kind of and we haven't really discussed this among we've had a few Willamette Valley vintners on, and we haven't really discussed the difference you think between, like you and I talked about earlier, Oregon and Burgundy are similar, but I think they still have their own, signature. And then California is a completely different animal when it comes to Pinot Noir. So you can kind of explain that to us, why that is. And
I would say that there's sort of, it's multifaceted. Like the reason that we think we're close to Burgundy is because climate-wise we're pretty similar. Latitude-wise we're very high up. We're at the 45th parallel here. We're north of the 45th parallel. So where I am here, growing grapes, we're north of like Toronto, Canada. So we're very northerly latitudes. So that's very similar to what Burgundy's saying. But then it comes down to incredible differences in soil types, right? So I'm sitting on an old volcanic vent in this very young basalt parent material. So the red hills of Dundee are a very, very different soil type than what you're seeing in Burgundy. So that's going to have a huge impact on the way the wine is produced. Even just the aspects, the way we face the sun, right? So Burgundy runs at a different exposure. They run north-south, whereas we tend to, or at least the ridge runs north-south. So their rows are east-west. We are north-south. So we're trying to maximize our sun exposure here. And then ultimately, it's a different culture. I think that there's a cultural impact, and that's a key component of terroir, is that there's a cultural piece, because every harvest, there's a bunch of us calling each other to talk through harvest decisions. We spend all year long tasting with each other and talking through winemaking. So we influence each other in our little bubble. And that also will have an impact, I think, on the way that the wines present. So, really, I think comes down to soil, place, people, and that's why we have these minute differences. Now, because our climate is so similar to Burgundy, our wines are much more similar than what you're seeing down in California. Much more southerly latitudes, a lot more heat. So the Pinots of California look almost nothing like the Pinots of France because there's just so much more heat. We're talking 50 to 100% more heat for a lot of those Pinot Noir growing regions than what we're seeing here and in France.
Can you tell us a little bit about how White Rose started in the vineyard? I know it's one of the most iconic vineyards in Oregon, and also the owner that had the vision to come up from California. And
yeah, absolutely. So we're on a special hillside because we're on the hill where Irie first planted those vines in 1965. So we're on the hillside where Oregon Pinot Noir was born. But Irie planted down at the bottom of the hill because, and actually, 50 years ago, it was a different kind of climate sort of setup. But again, I don't think people knew. They were basically just sort of throwing a dart on a hill in Oregon and sort of taking a bet that it might be a good place to grow Pinot Noir. So since it started there, and then vineyards sort of grew around them, as they started to prove the concept. So there's this beautiful sort of lineup of really old vineyards that go up the hill as people started to sort of become interested in grapes because their neighbor was suddenly having this sort of great, I wouldn't say great success, but at least was having a good time growing grapes. And, most of that hillside, you think back 50 years ago, 40 years ago, it was filberts, it was prunes, or, plums. So there were a number of orchards there that were sort of just struggling to get by. And so grapes sort of represented something very different and a sort of potential to try something very different with that property. So the White Rose Vineyard is 8 acres that was planted in 1978. It was actually a couple that planted it. It was sort of their little retirement project. She was from Yorkshire, England. They were the White Rose, and my cat's just pulled the laptop there. They were the White Rose in the War of the Roses. So that was her little call to home. So that's where the name White Rose came from, was just her sort of English roots. And for 20 years, she and her husband were content to sell those grapes to a number of storied Oregon wineries. So there was never any winemaking happening on site. It was just a production vineyard. And so those
tell them some of the names, because like Ken Wright at Panther Creek and
Ken Wright at Panther Creek, Tory Moore, Patty Green was at Tory Moore and buying grapes there. So there's a number of the old, and they were making a White Rose vineyard. It's always been, even in its early days, it's been 8 acres. You can only produce so much fruit, and especially the way that they were planting vines in the 70s. There's very few vines per acre. So the rows are about 10 feet wide. So you can drive a car down the rows now. Domaine Drouin, our neighbors with their more modern plantings, those are about 3 feet wide. So there's about 10 times the number of vines per acre on the modern sort of planting. So they're getting a lot more sort of yield out of their land. We're getting about a ton per acre out of our old vines. So when you have 8 acres and you're producing 8 tons of grapes, that's not a whole lot to go around. So, you know,
Well,
there's only so.
we talked about earlier too, the kind of the and these guys have heard this, the planted on natural or just
Yep.
own rootstock instead of American rootstock or whatever.
Yeah, and in the 70s, they were, you know, especially because it was a brand new growing region, it's so much cheaper to just basically, you can take a pruning of a cane of a vine from last year, and you can cut it up into 6 pieces and stick 6 of those, you know, pieces in the ground. As long as there's one bud on there, it will start roots and become a vine. And if you plant that, especially in Oregon in the 1970s, in a place that hasn't historically had grapevines, there's very low likelihood that phylloxera, which is the pest that will eventually attack those roots, is around. But it's a bit of it's a dangerous game, because eventually phylloxera was going to appear because it's grown into a much larger wine region. So, you know, when they established those early vineyards, it was so much cheaper for these guys. And a lot of these, you know, David Lett was, you know, he was essentially just a grad student, kind of just taking a bet with like what little money he had. You know, he had to just self-root and, you know,
which is Ivory Vineyard.
Yeah, exactly. And so even Ivory is facing, you know, they're having some phylloxera pressure because this mite, it lives in the soil around the United States. And so it wasn't until, you know, we got to the point where there was enough of it showing up that we started grafting vines. And the story of that, we might as well just jump into it, is that in the 1800s, somebody decided to take some grapevines from the United States and take them to France just to see how they grew. While the American grapevines had been evolving with this phylloxera in the soil here, well, they hitched a ride to France, and all the noble grape varieties that had been growing there for centuries had never seen this phylloxera pest, and it just essentially just depleted and it destroyed every vineyard across Europe.
One more reason for the Europeans to not like us.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, and the grapes that we took over were things like, you know, Welch's types of grapes, right? So these weren't even that great, you know, Scuppernong and all these horrible grape varieties. So I should have never crossed the pond, but it did. And what we discovered was that we could actually take the roots of the American grapevines, which had evolved with this pest and had a resistance, and we could graft the French grapevines on top. And so that was how they ultimately saved the European wine industry, which all now have a little taste of America, and at least on the root side. So we're experiencing that now. We are seeing some phylloxera attack parts of our vineyard. I actually took out 10 rows just in the last couple of weeks because of the most affected rows, because we sort of want to get those vines out of there so that you know, the pest won't proliferate. So it's a challenge, you know. But ultimately, what we have are these beautiful old vines that they're sort of they have a limited lifespan, but they're 40-year-old vines now, producing just beautiful, beautiful fruit. There's a quality of tannin, I think, and sort of flavor and texture that you just don't get with young vines. So there's something very special about the vines we have at White Rose.
So tell me about White Rose, like in general, just how it started. I know that you already talked about the original owners, but talk about the guy that came from California and bought it and why he did, and, you know, kind of that story.
Yeah, so our owner is a gentleman named Greg Sanders. He actually is from New Jersey originally, but made his way out to California and works in aerospace. So he has a little company down there that makes hinges for companies like Boeing and some other plane manufacturers. Gets obsessed with Pinot Noirs, realizes like this Pinot Noir is the ultimate wine. Like I have to figure out, I want to make Pinot Noir like what I'm having from Burgundy. And he thought, you know, I'm just going to go to France and buy a vineyard in France. So he flies out to France, does all this research, and realizes like, wow, it actually costs a lot of money to buy a vineyard in France. I don't have French vineyard money. Comes back, it's like, I live in California. There's a lot of Pinot Noir vineyards popping up in California. And he's like, man, it's pretty expensive to buy a vineyard in California. Maybe I'll check Oregon. Comes up to Oregon 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, Oregon was a very different world there. And had an appointment to see a vineyard, and was trying to find the vineyard to meet the owners. Got completely lost because it was all just tiny little gravel roads back then. He's so lost, he eventually just kind of stops and knocks on the door to try and sort of orient himself, and says, I'm on my way to see this vineyard. And the couple at the door said, well, actually, we have this little 8-acre vineyard and we've been considering selling it. Why don't we take a little walk through the vineyard? So it was complete kismet that he even found White Rose. But it's a very special place. It sits about 900 feet above the Willamette Valley. So we have a beautiful view of the entire Willamette Valley. It's of course got these now 40-year-old vines, so it's just a very special place. And the fact that we are on that hillside where we're at is just, we're very lucky.
So how we found White Rose is Scott and Bromley and Jeff and Sarah, and I think Craig and Jackie and Kathy and I, we all went to Oregon a couple years ago, maybe, I think about a couple years ago. And we asked Pam Walden at Willful Wine, any vineyards or any, you know, winery we should go visit, you know, that isn't necessarily distributed in Montana. And she said, oh, if you don't go to White Rose, you're an idiot. And in her nice little French accent, she probably used the F word, I'll bet. So we went to Domaine Serene, and we went to Domaine Drouin, and then we popped in to your guys' place, and you guys weren't distributing in Montana at the time. And my wife and her family are distributors. And so we popped in, and we thought your wines were maybe the best we've tasted. And I know that's subjective. So, you know, I mean, we love lots of Oregon wines, but man, we were just all so impressed. Excuse me. And so Kathy, that was just a peanut going down the wrong pipe. You guys aren't getting infected by that. We all agreed that Kathy needed to work on getting White Rose into Montana. And so she called, and I bet it was about 3 months or something, maybe later, we got to import or distribute, and I got to sell. And she's the only distributor in Montana, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, White Rose is exclusive to Eagle Beverage, and we absolutely love them. We sell a ton of them. And so I think maybe talk about the Hobbit House a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, well, there's a reason that nobody has really heard of us, is we only make about 2,000 to 2,500 cases a year. So it's an incredibly tiny production. And part of that is because we built a tiny little Hobbit House, so we can only make so much anyways. But we also employ pretty traditional methods. So the idea was, if we're going to look back to France, let's look back way back. And so we're really trying to use as little technology as possible. Everything is done by hand. So we harvest everything into little buckets. So we just little 20 pounds of grapes at a time. We bring those buckets in, we pour each bucket into the tank. So we're doing it all by hand, incredibly laboriously, let's say. Everything's pressed in old wooden basket presses. So similar to like what you might see in like an apple orchard or something like that. So it's all hand pressed, which is an incredibly long process. But the idea is that we're trying to be as gentle as we can with the fruit, to trying to use traditional methods and sort of, you know, essentially create old world Pinot Noir, let's say. So to do that is quite a bit of effort, and we can only make so much a year. So we distribute in a grand total of, I think, about 6 states. So it's great to be in Montana. There's very few other parts of the country that even see White Rose wine. So we essentially just hope that people will come and visit us, because it really is a beautiful and special place. So
the Hobbit House is seriously a Hobbit House. It is. It's like a mound, and it's got grass over the top, and it's got windows about this big, and it overlooks, like, you go to Domaine Roy, you go to Soder Vineyards or whatever, they have this grand view of the whole Willamette Valley, and you guys have this tiny, beautiful, fun, welcoming house. And they also have fun meat and cheese trays and espresso, I think. Yeah, espresso.
We do. We finish with a beautiful espresso. That's kind of, which I always love, because again, that's that callback to kind of European culture, is we love people to just have a nice shot after the flight. Although I always wonder what it means for the next winery they visit, because it probably just shatters their palate. But I wonder if I can, Tara, do you think I can share? I've got some photos here for you guys. I'll see if this comes through. Okay. Let's see here.
We've had such good luck with this over the last 15 days. I can't imagine it won't work.
Is that showing? Is that coming through at all?
Nice.
Okay. Because there we go. This is the Hobbit House, sort of sitting up at 900 feet. So it's a very tiny, tiny little tasting room. It's one of the smallest wineries, honestly, in the valley. So I thought it would be good just to kind of show it's, you know, it's just, it is a stunning place to visit. And I'm mostly focused on I don't have any shots of the tasting room, unfortunately. This is kind of what we talked about a little bit earlier. We did acquire the property in 2001, and we built our little winery in 2004. But this is actually the downstairs of the Hobbit House. So this is kind of where it all happens. So you're looking at the entirety of the winery right here. So the production floor is incredibly small compared to a lot of different wineries. And again, it is all just done by hand in these few tanks that we have in here. Those are the little buckets I was referring to. So we really are picking 20 pounds at a time into these little canvas buckets. And then bringing it up into the winery and just essentially handing one bucket at a time up the ladder to somebody who's sitting at the top and filling each tank. So our biggest tanks, that means something on the order of about 800 to 1,000 bucket loads of Pinot Noir to fill up each tank.
And you guys are exclusively Pinot Noir, right?
Exclusively Pinot Noir, and that really comes down to sort of the techniques that we have available. It ultimately comes down to the press that we have. So that little basket press, which we'll see on the next slide here, unfortunately, we couldn't make a decent Chardonnay out of that if we tried. So it's really all about
that's punch down, right?
It is, and we don't really utilize that as much anymore. We're really focused almost exclusively on pump overs now. So we hook a tank pump to the bottom of the tank and just gently bring the wine up over the top. And again, that's a way to sort of control the textural aspects of the wine. And as we've gone to, I think we make very sort of ethereal, very lightly textured wines. It's pretty important for us to not over extract. And so we're using the punch down a lot less, but it's important twice a day to try and get the top of that fermentation turned over. With whole cluster, and we're using 100% whole cluster wines, so we should probably jump into what makes our wines so different than a lot of other Pinot Noirs.
You got so much going on. You got malolactic fermentation, you got punched overs, you got
there's so many. Yeah, it's, you know, in the end it's kind of interesting, right? Because we're all sort of dealing, you know, in Oregon and on our hilltop, we're all dealing with the same or very similar fruit, but we all end up with these very different wines. And it's because there's so many decision points along the way where we can sort of exert our own philosophy or intent and really sort of drive that wine to a different place. And so for us, we want to make this 100% whole cluster wine. We don't destem the grapes from the stems at all. And suddenly having those stems in the fermentation really changes things. So even just the dynamics of the fermentation change quite a bit. So if you think the most sort of stylized version of this would be Beaujolais Nouveau. This is what they do there. And so they really try to get this carbonic maceration character. And so this is what happens when we just pile up grapes in a tank and we seal the tank and don't do anything. The fermentation actually starts enzymatically inside the grape. And so that actually creates a lot of these esters, and it becomes very tutti fruity and bubblegummy. And so that's why Beaujolais, they just basically seal those tanks up and never do anything because they want to enhance all that bubblegum character. And that's very a stylized version of what they do. For us, we don't want our Pinot Noirs to be bubblegummy and sort of artificially fruited. So we do get the fermentation rolling as quickly as we can, but that tank is so large, in the core of that tank, some of that carbonic maceration is happening. But there's just enough of it happening that I think what it does is the terroir of the hills where we're at, if you had one word to describe what the wines taste like, I think most people would say cherry, that like cherry is the way you would describe Oregon Pinot Noir from the Dundee Hills. But that carbonic maceration and that lifting of the fruit takes our wines from cherry, I think, to like strawberry and raspberry. So it changes the fruit character. And then having the stems in there, they are adding flavors as well. And so if they're too green, I see a lot of green stems in the top of the tank here. I might expect a little more kind of green pepper. As the stems mature and as they lignify, we tend to see more white pepper, black pepper, even cinnamon and some of these bark components. And so what we love about the whole cluster fermentation is that it's taking our wines away from being sort of just fruit and earth based and adding a lot of these sort of spice elements. And so we think that whole cluster fermentations tend to kind of draw you in a little more because there's so many more aromatic elements to sort of figure out that you spend a lot more time kind of contemplating the wines.
You and I talked about points, and we work hard at Fifth and Wine not to be point whores, where we just say this got 98 and you should buy it.
Yeah.
But it's amazing. I looked at your wines today, and you guys get points like crazy, like 95, 94, 93, 98, 96. Like,
so there's, you know, something that we love to brag about in Oregon is that, you know, I mean, the Oregon wine world is my whole life, but ultimately Oregon only makes 1.5% of the entire production of US wine, right? So we're just a drop in the bucket. But Oregon ultimately is responsible for 20% of scores 90 or higher in wine publications. So, you know, that we think that that really speaks to the quality of the wines here, and that there's something very special about this place for growing wine or for growing grapes that that even the critics have noticed that. I mean, that's a huge, we're punching way above our weight class. And so that really speaks to that. And we're very proud of those scores, but a number of our neighbors are getting scores just as well. And it speaks to how good the ground is that we're growing these grapes.
Yeah, the Dundee Hills is pretty interesting. And maybe you could, I know we did with Irie, but maybe revisit that Dundee Hills, well, part of it is Montana soil, I think, right?
Well, yeah, so we have Montana boulders all over, and that was the key to discovering what was going on in the Willamette Valley, because there was a geologist in the 1920s wondering why we had Montana boulders scattered all over the Willamette Valley, and tried to make sense of why we also have topsoil that's 100 feet deep in the valley, and it's incredibly fertile and in growing region. And it turned out that's when he sort of put together the theory of the Missoula floods, which were the once every 50 years massive floods that were washing from Montana all the way across Washington and into Oregon, and basically bringing all of Washington's topsoil down in the Willamette Valley. And as it turns out, though, that the Willamette Valley is too fertile for grape growing. So the thing with growing wine grapes is that we actually don't want them to have sort of everything they need. We want them to struggle a little bit. So in Oregon, we have to do that by getting up onto the hillsides, because the hillsides here have thinner topsoils, years of erosion that have really brought down. So our topsoil in a lot of our vineyards is really only about 12 to 18 inches deep, compared to what you're seeing down in the valley where it's going tens of feet deep. So we're actually up on these hillsides because we want to sort of starve the vines a little more. And then also because it's so rainy here, we need a little more
It's like going to a restaurant in the middle of coronavirus.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there was a great metaphor. My wife had a coworker who said that grapes are kind of like people. The ones who were always given everything they needed don't ever turn out quite as interesting as the people that really work for it. So we want to make these grapes work for it a little bit. We don't want to just coddle them. So we always keep them kind of right on the edge of starvation, right? So we don't irrigate our vines, and these thin soils, they're always just struggling a little bit. And so the plant's response is, okay, it's looking a little iffy, might not make it through this next growing season. So I'm going to make this really beautiful concentrated grape with a seed, and hopefully that seed will be, eaten by a bird and spread somewhere else. So it's all about that sort of natural desire to proliferate. So, we want to starve those grapes a little bit, and we do a good job of that on the hillsides. Where we are, we're up at 900 feet. It's very thin soils. We're not getting as much heat. There's a lot of wind blowing through there. It cools off pretty quickly in the afternoon. So those vines struggle.
So I guess we should probably get on to this wine that's in our glass. Do you have the same one, that 15?
I do. I have what's that?
The Willamette Valley 15?
Yes. Yeah. And
tell us about where the vineyards come from, and kind of, aromas and tastes you get. I know everybody has their own taste buds, but maybe you can talk through.
So this is a wine that we sort of developed for distribution. Again, we're 2,000 cases, so we don't have too many wines or too many SKUs in our portfolio, but this is kind of the little sample of everything we have in the cellar. So it's comprised of 14 different vineyards, and we do a lot of experimentation at the winery, and that's been a great sort of tradition at White Rose, is that we spend a lot of time looking at style. Even this idea of like the 100% whole cluster thing, we spent years experimenting with that before we actually went 100% whole cluster across the whole production. So it wasn't until 2015 that every wine from White Rose was 100% whole cluster. So prior to that, some were, some weren't, because we were trying to dial in the method.
Wait, sorry. It's 2014 we have.
Yeah, and
it's hard to get
that bump.
This coronavirus outbreak, so you
And we, so we spend a lot of time, we do a lot of exploring different vineyards, different AVAs. And we actually take the products of those experiments and share them with our wine club. So our biggest wine club is really all about, each year is some sort of experimenting with wine production. So this year we're currently working with use of oxygen. So we're doing things, we're doing an élevage trial. So where the wine will be in barrel 10 months, same wine, but 10 months in barrel, 16 months in barrel, 22 months in barrel, 28 months in barrel. And so looking at, you'll get all those bottles side by side and get a sort of a sense of what does barrel aging do for wine quality. So this is kind of taking all those experiments and all those little pieces of the cellar and putting them together as just sort of a general statement about Oregon Pinot, which is fantastic, right? And so we make this to distribute to out of state so we can just kind of introduce people to the White Rose style.
So we talked earlier today about, I think this is about a $30 wine, right, Tara?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we have one that's $142 bottle of wine on our shelves. We always keep everything that we can get from White Rose on our shelves because we love it so much. So
Awesome.
you and I talked about, maybe you could talk about why we would spend $30 or $142 on a bottle of wine.
Yeah, it comes down to provenance of site is a big one. So, we're experimenting with sites that are sort of newly established vineyards or from areas that haven't really proven themselves nearly as much as someplace like, a premium property like ours in the Dundee Hills, at the top of the Dundee Hills. And then it comes down to scarcity. There's the White Rose Vineyard, like I said, it's 8 acres now, producing only about 8 to 9 tons a year. So there's not a whole lot of it. But then those 40-year-old vines produce a wine that's unlike, I think this is a very beautiful wine. This is an incredibly nice Pinot.
Yeah.
But you taste it side by side with the White Rose, and there's just something about the sort of the quality of tannin in the White Rose wines. So those 40-year-old vines produce just the most beautiful textural wines you can imagine. And so that's really what speaks to that difference in price.
And then I don't know how much of a foodie you are. I think you obviously you're in this business, so we're all kind of foodies. But if you were going to pair something with this tonight or tomorrow night, because everybody's probably going to buy another one so they can pair it tomorrow night. Because we can't drink on Sunday. What the hell, right?
Yeah. So the ultimate pairing for Pinot Noir is salmon, and it's been really nice for me because when I left Oregon, after high school, I was so tired of salmon. I grew up on the ocean. We ate salmon all the time, and I just thought, why do people eat salmon so much? Then I spent 15 years away from Oregon thinking, like, my God, the salmon and the seafood in these places is just not nearly on par. And so since I got back to Oregon, I have just been on a tear eating as much salmon as I possibly can. So that's kind of like our go-to fish here at the house, because not only is it just fantastic here in the Northwest, but it pairs so well with Pinot Noir.
Yeah.
I told these guys earlier when I was on with Irie, I had the privilege of sitting with Jason Lett at the Pinot camp, and they did they had coals going down the middle.
Yep.
So it was like, it was the indigenous people, and then they put fletches of salmon over alderwood.
Yeah. The flayed salmon right over the fire pit. Yeah.
And then Jason brought out, I think, I don't know, 1984 or whatever, 86 something, double magnum of Pinot Noir. And it's like, if you're in the wine business, like being in Mecca, if you're a Muslim, I guess, or whatever, it's just matched perfectly. And I agree. But I think it has to be grilled, or it has to be something where you have a little char to it.
Yeah.
Right?
So we broil typically here, or if, now that the weather's getting better, we'll get the barbecue out and start to grill a little bit. Jason is like the most popular kid at the Salmon Bake. I always try to find him because I know he's always going to have those bottles from like the late 70s or early 80s. So we always like hunt him down. Everybody in the industry is just sort of like kind of congealate all around Jason, just hoping for that little sip of an incredible old Irie wine.
Can you talk a little bit about the kind of the spirit of Oregon wine, and how you guys all work together, and if that's going to continue as you guys see more Louis Jadot and Kendall Jackson and whatever flowing in?
I think it's an interesting thing because we're getting to a point now where we, like I said, those scores, people take notice. They take notice that, one, we're getting incredible scores, and two, that our bottle price points are much higher than a lot of other places. And there's a reason for that. We can't grow that much, and the quality is great, and we have to do everything by hand here. But people take notice. And so we've had, our neighbors, Vista Hills were bought by Francis Ford Coppola 2 years ago. There's a fair bit of, Jadot actually planted a vineyard just below White Rose. So there's a lot of investment from France and California. And I think it's a good thing, but I'm also sort of a little, worried in some ways. I mean, that we're going to mature and change, and probably the landscape here will weirdly look like California in the future. And that's good and bad. I think that, having Kendall Jackson here, they're sending Willamette Valley Pinot Noir blends out to a much broader audience at a pretty decently affordable price point. So if they can introduce people to Oregon Pinot Noir, then, if we can get more people to Oregon to visit us, that's great, because, our business is really about having people come to us.
We talked with Ken Wright, I think about a year ago, and he was on a kind of a mission to make sure that Pinot Noir can be pure in Oregon, like 100%. Like, you talk about the 75% in California and your guys' rules a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, and so yeah, in California, the law is if it's 75% of one grape, then you're allowed to call it that grape. So you could make a Pinot Noir that's 75% Pinot, 25% Cabernet. It would probably resemble nothing like Pinot Noir, but you could officially just call that a Pinot Noir and not have to disclose that you had a lot of Cabernet in there, you know? So Oregon has always been 90%. The funny thing is, there really hasn't been a whole lot of blending because we just really can't grow many other grapes here. And we didn't plant any other red grapes. So 65% of the entire state is Pinot Noir. And that covers a lot of different growing regions that are growing, you know, warmer weather grapes. So Pinot Noir is all we really have up here in the valley. So most people have been 100% Pinot Noir. It wasn't really until some of these lower price point wines came along and that maybe a little other, you know, a few other grapes were sneaking in. And what we saw was we had some, you know, larger production California wineries that were buying a lot of grapes and then maybe, you know, let's say overcropping those. So, you know, I hang 1 to 3 tons per acre. They might have been hanging 5 to 6 tons of Pinot per acre. And that'll make for a pretty weak kind of insipid Pinot Noir. But if you can kind of give it some guts with a tiny bit of, you know, Syrah or Cab, maybe that kind of makes it seem like a much more high quality wine. So people were starting to probably put a little bit in there. And so they just wanted to make sure that's not happening in the Willamette Valley, but there's a lot of Pinot being grown in other parts of Oregon. And so that was sort of their attempt to make sure that when you drink Oregon Pinot Noir, what you're getting is just Pinot Noir. So
I think in my experience in the Oregon world, it's very collaborative, very, you know, everybody shares. I think when you read about California and Napa in the early, 70s or 60s, kind of the same thing. So do you find yourself sharing with wineries and like you talked about earlier, maybe you talk about the harvest or you talk about whatever's going on and you all kind of make decisions based on that?
We do, and that's still a very big part of our industry is that collaborative aspect. And to their credit too, I will say the Kendall Jacksons, the Jadots, a number of the outside folks who have come in, they've respected that culture. So, you know, when we get together, I'm on a Chardonnay board that meets once a year. To basically spends about 8 hours just tasting about 100 barrel samples of Chardonnay from almost every winery in the Willamette Valley that's making Chardonnay, and sits and looks at reams of data around those, and we argue about style and production methods all day long. Kendall Jackson's at that table, so you know, Penner-Ash and Willa Kinsey, they're there because those companies are respecting the culture we have here, because I think in some ways they're really drawn to how well that's worked for us here, because we are sort of all helping each other. I think we sort of really live by the, you know, the rising tide lifts all boats theory. So we spend a lot of time helping each other out. And that's meant things like, you know, we had a major fire last year that I lost a lot of my winemaking equipment, which is in an old barn that burned down. And I had people reaching out and offering to loan me equipment and different things like that. So there's a lot of that, just like everybody has each other's back here. And it's really a great part of the wine culture here. And I think that like you see these French companies, California companies think like, wow, that's actually pretty special. And so they've really actually respected that kind of local culture. So we're pretty happy about that.
What a fun place to visit too. We're going to put a trip together. We talked about it with Irie, and we would love to come to White Rose too. And we're going to do 20 people or something and well, hopefully we'll bring them out in September or October or something like that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I always tell people that's the time to visit a winery is harvest, because it's, you know, winery, that time of harvest, it smells unlike, you know, the smells of fermentation, just the excitement of harvest, to have a chance to see that, to taste a wine that's fermenting, it's unlike anything. And so it's just, you know, it's such a special time to come by. So I would highly, highly recommend that.
All right, Tress, unless anybody else has other questions, do you have anything else you want to share?
It's Whitney's birthday tonight, so I just wanted to say happy birthday to
which is my daughter.
Happy birthday. I forgot I wanted to share just one quick photo, because I didn't show you let's see if it'll come through here. That's the old press there. So that's what that pressing by hand looks like. That's an incredibly labor-intensive process. So you can see what the fermenter, after the fermentation, those grapes look almost completely unchanged. You know, they haven't been touched by a punch down at the bottom of the tank. But we sit there, it takes us about 8 hours to press off one tank, because we have to do about 12 press cycles, because you have to sort of manually shovel in, slowly crank it down. You're taking it out with 5-gallon buckets. And so that's a little bit of the sort of hands-on approach that we're taking here.
Who is doing this? Nobody's doing this.
Nobody else is doing this because it's completely unscalable and nobody has the time to do this. So yeah, we do, which is kind of nice. And that was one thing that really attracted me to White Rose was I've worked at some pretty complex wineries where I was managing over 100 fermentations simultaneously. I get to manage 10 fermentations and spend hours with each one of those fermentations every day. And so that I think that allows for better quality and focus. And so that's what really brought me to White Rose.
You can really taste the difference too. It's like the carbonic, I think. Did we explain that already, what carbonic is?
Yeah.
As far as the flavor, like not banana, but the fruit driven along with the tannin, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, carbonic done well, it's that lifting of fruit. It is that raspberry, strawberry, and sometimes you get floral notes. I think a lot of people will find floral notes in our wines, and I think that's pretty special. I think that's what sort of differentiates them as well.
We got a question, a couple of them. Are you guys organic or biodynamic? And then what happens with the leftover must there?
So the leftover must, that cake there, we put it into compost piles and then we compost it and then spread it back into the vineyard, actually. We are working on sustainable, so we're using some techniques. The big one is what people sort of took a long time to sort of get away from was spraying Roundup because it was so easy to spray it under the vine, and so we've stopped doing that. But we use a little tiller which sort of goes under the vine and around it, and so it's incredibly, again, labor-intensive process because it takes, so you've got miles of rows to sort of take care of there. But that was the big one, is that like we have to get rid of all that material below the vine, and so we've gone to a sustainable approach there. We actually do use yeast in our fermentations because it's a bit of a race with that carbonic fermentation. So we want the alcoholic fermentation to outpace the carbonic fermentation pretty quickly, and so inoculating with yeast actually helps us do that.
You still have to talk about malolactic fermentation, then we'll quit geeking out.
All right, so malolactic fermentation is what we call a secondary fermentation, and it's sort of a fermentation, but essentially it's a bacterial fermentation where malolactic bacteria are converting malic acid, which is a very sharp acid, very crisp acid, to lactic acid, which has a sort of more smooth and rounded texture to it. Typically happens in barrel, and it's a very slow process. It can usually take anywhere from months to, depending on how cold your cellar is, it can even take up to a year. But the bacteria are sort of just sitting there slowly chewing away at these acids, and they're releasing carbon dioxide. You can't, during the malolactic fermentation though, add sulfur to your wine, so it's kind of a scary time. You've gotten through your primary fermentation, you've made a dry red wine, you've put it down to barrel, but you can't use any sulfur until that fermentation is complete. And that fermentation is complete almost always in red wines. Almost every red wine goes through 100% malolactic fermentation because it helps sort of round out the texture of the wine. And then you also have no chance of it re-fermenting in bottle because the malolactic fermentation does create carbon dioxide. If you don't actually use up all that malic acid, there's a chance it could restart in your bottle and actually carbonate your wine. And most people don't enjoy carbonated red wines. It's a really big, so we're all gonna use it for our red wines. It really becomes a style choice when you're looking at white wines because you can sort of choose how much of that fermentation you want to use. And so that's a big choice you'll hear with Chardonnay especially, because you start with at a pretty high acid place and you can use a malolactic fermentation to sort of smooth out and sort of change the structure of your Chardonnay. So that becomes a huge style choice when making Chardonnay. I was studying it in Oregon because 12, 13 years ago, 15 years ago, when it was much cooler, especially the Oregon Pinot Noirs were incredibly pale. I mean, like see-through, very light red wines. And there was a lot of concern then because the market wasn't, I think, quite as sort of in the know about Pinot Noir, that consumers were thinking that light, pale wines were somehow of lesser quality than like these dark, really concentrated California wines. So we were looking at a lot of different methods to try and sort of understand why we were losing color, because it seemed like during malolactic fermentation, we were losing bits of color. And so our wines were getting even paler during this process in barrel. So my research was really focused on trying to sort of preserve the color of these Pinot Noirs because we were worried people are going to think our Pinots were somehow like of inferior quality. And then after I published all my research, we've had nothing but hot vintages ever since. And like our wines are so much darker colored now. Nobody worries about color in malolactic fermentation anymore. There's like plenty of color now in our grapes. And so
that's pretty odd, Tress, because somebody just said climate change. And I think that is, so when I first was introduced to Oregon wine, I guess 2007 was kind of a light vintage, 2011. 12 was huge, you know, and then pretty much from there on, you guys have been not so vintage challenged, which I find kind of, to me, it's kind of less interesting. I loved Oregon wine where you kind of every vintage you got something different, but
yeah, and it's sad because I think Oregon, you know, Pinot Noir really grows best on the margins. You know, we kind of talked about starving it a little bit. It's a pretty fickle grape, and again, I think if it has too much of what it needs, it tends to just quickly fall off and to just sort of insipid. So we want it kind of right against that edge of having everything it needs, and part of that's heat, you know, and the heat that we're getting in years like 15 and 16 is like 50% more heat than we saw in years like 2007 and 2011. So it's a huge shift. And we've always celebrated the vintage variation, but it seems
I love that.
pendulum is swinging so far now, you know, and these hot vintages are tough for us as wine growers. We've gotten much better. I think the 14s and 15s, we got hit a little bit. That was still sort of new to us. And so we've changed our farming practices and some of our winemaking practices. So we're still making 13% alcohol Pinot Noirs, even in this sort of, you know, intense heat we're facing, but we only have so much of a margin to shift our sort of cultural practices before we kind of hit a hard sort of edge, and we'll have to sort of start thinking about, you know, do we start to plant different grapes here? What do we do?
No, Tress, I think you moved to Montana.
Well, that'd be great. Yeah, it's those cold winters that are the challenge. But you see British Columbia is planting a lot of Pinot Noir,
exactly.
right? So it's the northern migration is underway.
Okanagan Valley, right?
Yeah,
making some great stuff.
Exactly.
All right, I think we'll call it a night. It's been really, really fun. And Tress, we would love to give you a cheers if you have any
Cheers,
wine.
guys.
Cheers. We have the Oregon glasses. Do you too, Tress?
I do, and I know it's probably not coming through, but I even have a little White Rose Estate Oregon Pinot Noir glass here. So
tell everybody about the reason that Riedel came up with the little tulip.
So the idea was that, you know, especially back in those cooler vintage days, our wines were so delicate that the idea was to sort of go big and increase the surface area and then sort of concentrate in. So it was to try and take these sort of ephemeral aromas and really try to concentrate them so you could really smell the wines. I think it's kind of hilarious, especially our wines, they jump right out of the glass.
Exactly.
So you don't really need this sort of concentration effect, but it's nice to have. And the thing I always love about these glasses is that you can fit an entire bottle of wine in one of these glasses.
20, but honey, I only had one glass. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Honestly, that's so much information and so much fun. And we love hearing from you and hope to see you in the market again soon.
I hope to see you soon. It'd be nice just to see people in person again. So it's nice to at least for us all to be able to talk here tonight and drink some nice wine. But boy, it'll be nice to see you in person soon.
Yep. All right.
Thanks,
cheers, everybody.
guys.
All right, guys. Cheers. Thank you. All right. I'm done. Oh, you should have. Oh, sorry.
Whitney. Oh, hi. Hi, Brom.
Hi.
I didn't know I was highlighting their video to everybody. I thought I was doing it on my own computer.
Where'd Brian go?
Hi,
What?
Paulson. Hi,
There we
Whitney.
go.
Can you
We
hear us?
this is after hours. This is
Yeah.
Is
Yep.
everybody? That's not good. Can you hear us?
Did you start by chance earlier in the day? Mark said you were at the store.
We were.
we were and then we went and this is
We've been doing this all day.
They picked me up. They picked me up at Hobby Lobby.
we're just happy to have a kid all of a sudden in the group.
Just picking up some crafts there, Gary?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we met each other at Hobby Lobby, and I just caught a ride.
Sorry, Tara. I cheated on the red. We had white tonight.
Oh, what the heck?
No.
It's a light red, too.
Whitney, happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh,
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday to you.
Let's go. Fireball.
That will scar her for life.
Happy birthday, dear Whitney.
Happy birthday to you.
Where'd your dad go?
All right.
All right, we're checking out.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Oh, that's my glass. That's my glass. Cheers. He's still in my white.
Not good. Bye, kids.
All right.
See you guys.
Guys, bye.
All right. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
Can't leave it.